Hello everyone and welcome back to Heritage Collections Management 2022. Over to you, Alex.
Thank you, James. Go ahead and share my screen. Welcome back to track 2 for decolonization, not just a buzzword. If you're looking for metadata is everything, head to track 1 and send your questions into the Q&A tab at any point throughout the session. My name is Alex Kron, and I am the Digital Operations and Collections Information Analyst for the Balboa Park Online Collaborative, or BPOC. I am honored and thrilled to be the moderator for this session and to help facilitate this critical conversation today. I'm especially excited to hear Kara and Nicole talk because of BPOC's own webinar series last year called Dreaming of a New Collections Management System. Kara was kind enough to participate in our series and share her work and her organization's work with us. Now, enough about me. I'd like to introduce Kara Vetter from the Museum of Us. Kara is the Director of Cultural Resources at the Museum of Us, located here in San Diego, California. It's located in the unceded ancestral homelands of the Kumeyaay Nation. In collaboration with Indigenous stakeholders and museum leadership, Kara leads a team of dedicated cultural resource management professionals who strive to create and implement culturally sensitive care policies and practices that center Indigenous sovereignty and traditional knowledge within a decolonizing initiatives context. Currently, Kara sits on the board of Association of Registrars and Collection Specialists and is part of the Enrich Cultural Institutions Network. Next, we have Nicole Crawford, who joined the University of Wyoming Art Museum in 2009 as the Curator of Collections and is currently Director and Chief Curator, formerly the Vice President of Gallery Operations and Director at the Gerald Peters Gallery in Santa Fe. She supervised staff, conducted research, and worked with numerous collectors during her 8 years with the gallery. Previously, she was the curatorial assistant at the Sheldon Museum of Art on the University of Nebraska campus and completed the academic internship program at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. In her role at the UW Art Museum, she leads the curatorial team to oversee, plan, manage, and implement the exhibition schedule, supervises curatorial staff, oversees the development of the museum's collection, serves as the curatorial lead and content authority for all exhibitions, enables internship opportunities in collections research and scholarship, teaches museum studies courses, leads museum-based study abroad courses, and chairs the museum's collections advisory committee. Her international projects include extensive work with cultural reconciliation through the display of objects and contemporary art in post-colonial, post-conflict societies. Crawford has a dual MA in Art History and Museum Studies and a BA in Art History from the University of Nebraska and a certificate in Arts Management from the UCI Paul Marriage School of Business at the University of California, Irvine. She is currently pursuing a PhD in philosophy, aesthetics, and art theory from the Institute for Doctoral Studies in Visual Art. Her current research is focused on the role of collector in the acquisition, care, documentation, and display of objects, both through the collector's vision and the responsibility of the museum. So we're going to go ahead and start with Kara. Let's hear a little bit about your work.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be speaking with Nicole and working with you, Alex, on this presentation and just sharing the knowledge that I've learned over the years. Would you mind advancing to the next slide, please? Thank you very much. So the slide you see here is an aerial view of our institution. We are centered in what is known as Balboa Park here in San Diego, and it's a beautiful, very old building. And what we usually do is we like to give a land acknowledgement, and it's important to give land acknowledgements as they are a formal statement and public recognition of the Indigenous peoples who've been displaced and dispossessed from their ancestral homeland because of colonial and historic reasons. The Balboa Park in particular displaced Kumeyaay Nation members, and we actively work with the Kumeyaay community to this day to work to redress the colonial harm that that displacement, as well as what our institution stands for as a museum, is today. These acknowledgements are but one of many, many steps that organizations and institutions can make to acknowledge the indigenous peoples of the land, and they should really be authentic. And they should act as but one entry point into more equitable and humble decolonial practice. Could you advance the next? Thank you. So the land acknowledgement that the Museum of Us uses is that we recognize that we sit on the unceded ancestral homeland of the Kumeyaay Nation. The museum extends its respect and its gratitude to the Kumeyaay peoples who have lived here for over a millennia. They continue to care for and maintain connection to this ancestral homeland. And as you see from this image is a general representation of Kumeyaay's traditional territory prior to the Spanish incursion into their homelands in the 1700s. And you can see from the diagram that the US-Mexico border split their community in half. And so the repercussions of colonialism have been immediate and impactful upon the community. And that's something that I wanted to recognize today, so that when we are working with communities, we're working with communities that are in two different countries as well. Would you mind advancing to the next slide? So the main question I wanted to kind of ponder and talk about today is one that I've received, my colleagues have received over more recently, is that, can a museum decolonize? Is it possible? Can something that is inherently colonial become decolonial? And museums are in a really unique position as they hold a great deal of power, a great deal of influence within the current dominant society. Yet we know now that they have a very deep and often dark colonial legacy of harm, of exclusion, and erasure of Black, Indigenous, and communities of color, or BIPOC communities. That said, museums and our collective society as a whole, especially the last couple of years, seems to be at this really huge tipping point where we can no longer privilege one dominant experience, one dominant narrative, one dominant voice. And so in thinking on this question, we recognize that the answer to this question, at least in part, is one of hope. We hope that museums can become decolonial. And so we try to turn that hope into a reality. In doing this decolonial work, we recognize that it can be incredibly complex, and it can be very nonlinear depending on how an individual institution has participated in the colonial endeavor. Every institution has a story that may be reminiscent of other institutions, but it is uniquely their own, and that is a history that they have to grapple with. At the Museum of Us, we undertake decolonial practice based in part on the work of Ho-Chunk scholar Amy Lonetree, whose seminal book, Decolonizing Museums, lays out a framework of practice that includes 4 guiding principles. And they're not in any particular order, and I have them listed to the right here. But one of the first principles is around truth-telling and accountability. It's about actively practicing truth-telling and accountability around our colonial legacy and the ways in which those actions, those histories have replicated colonial practice and thought, the ways in which we treated the community members from who we have cultural resources, the ways in which we allowed scientific study of their ancestral remains without their consent. These are ways in which we have replicated colonial practice and perpetrated colonial harm. This also means that we also have to work to recognize how our current practice, our current thoughts and mindsets might perpetrate colonial harm. So it's not a checkbox of we've done this, move to the next thing. It's a constant act of questioning, are we doing what we need to be doing? How can we do better? The second principle is around ownership, specifically rethinking ownership. It's about honoring Indigenous ownership to their material culture and to their intellectual property. It's also about repatriation, both the tangible cultural resources and ancestors, as well as the intangible, that intellectual property. And it's also about making sure that we're not erecting any barriers for communities to meet before repatriation can take place. In the United States, there is NAGPRA law that is our floor, essentially. That gives us the basis. The NAGPRA law is the Native American Graves Protection Repatriation Act. It's a federal law that mandates how museums and federal institutions that might hold ancestors or culturally affiliated belongings back to Native American and Native Hawaiian organizations. So the NAGPRA is our floor, and we always seek to go above and beyond that. The third guiding principle is around changing our systems and our policies. And for us, it's been about changing our language, changing our practice, changing the policies. It's where we've had a lot of change and growth. And after a lot of introspection and conversations with Indigenous communities, stakeholders, and especially those most impacted by our historic practices, our home community and the communities within this region, that we have made some broad sweeping change over the last 5, 6, 7 years that have had both small and large impacts. So on the larger side of things, larger scale of things, this has included the passage of our policy on the creation of human remains, which details our commitment to stewarding ancestral human remains through informed consent of the descendant communities, and that we do not put ancestors on display without their informed consent. Honestly, we don't really put ancestors on display any longer at all, because generally most communities don't do that and do not want that. We have also passed the Colonial Pathways policy that outlines the various ways in which cultural resources and ancestors have come into our legal control, as well as details how these belongings, these individuals can be repatriated back to their descendant communities above and beyond what the current requirements of US, state, and federal laws are. On the smaller yet still incredibly important side of change is of how we have modified and changed our language in our everyday. We've changed how we refer to our storage rooms. They used to be called labs, which was very off-putting to many communities who would come to visit. It made them feel like they were being treated as specimens, and that's not what we wanted. So just changing that shift to, storage rooms, making sure that we have our former physical anthropology lab is now, the Willows, the sanctuary and repository space for the ancestors. And then also, like I said before, we no longer call the ancestors, any of the ancestral remains that we currently hold and steward, we do not call them specimens or subjects or things. And we take our personal ownership language out of the equation entirely and only refer to them as ancestors, and recognizing that this is a really prime example of how colonialism has supported the dehumanization of these communities. And it's about bringing the humanity back into the conversation in our everyday language. Also, this principle is about prioritizing and centering and honoring Indigenous voice, their knowledge, and their requests, and taking these requests seriously and not just, shuffling it off to the side. They are our partners, and we need to treat them with equality, equity, and respect. The fourth principle is around inclusion and representation. It's again about recognizing and honoring Indigenous authority, ignoring or honoring their sovereignty, because they are sovereign nations. They have their own rights, and we need to recognize that. And it's also about recognizing that we need to have representation from BIPOC communities at all levels of the decision-making process. So that means making sure that our staff is representative of the communities that we're working with, making sure that our board is representative of the communities that we're working with. And it's not a fast process. It's one where we're growing and learning. And we want to make sure that as we move forward, we're bringing in people who are ready to do this work with us and making sure that we are ready to do the work with them. It's a huge learning curve and something that we gratefully undertake. There's also an additional practice that is interwoven with the previous four, but that should be called out as it centers reciprocity. It's an acknowledgement that we, the museums do not own Indigenous knowledge, that we may be the caretakers of it in this moment, but that we are not the owners of it. Even if it is knowledge that was gained by staff researchers, on museum business, this knowledge is still not ours. It was gained by utilizing cultural resources, ancestral remains without consent typically. And so we need to recognize that we do not have authority over this, and that we need to make sure that when we're sharing information, it's being shared in the same spirit with which it was shared with us, which means it's only with Indigenous consent. And so this impacts our policy making around access, around who can have access and when, and it's an ongoing conversation that we have to have with every single community that we're working with. And I don't want to take up too much more time because I want to make sure Nicole has plenty of time to speak. But there are many more ways that museums can enact decolonial practices in keeping with these principles. And moving into the future, we at the museum are really constantly asking ourselves, how can we do better? What lessons can we learn as we do this work? And how can we ensure that we are always centering the community's needs above our own, in concert with our own? How can we make sure that what we do is not performative, but rather is transformative in nature? And then, these are just like the questions that keep me up at night, but also what gives me hope for museums being able to change and become the true equitable partners in stewarding cultural heritage that we should be. So if you want to move to the next slide, I just want to say thank you for letting me talk about, some of the practices that we've enacted at the museum, our decolonial ethos, our practices, how we do what we do. And if anyone ever has any questions, you are welcome to reach out to me. Thank you. And over to Nicole.
Thank you. I really have to commend the Museum of Us because they're actually doing the work that we're all talking about. And I think we spend a lot of time pointing elsewhere, especially across the oceans, and think our partners overseas need to do a lot of the work before we even look inward at ourselves in the US. So you guys are doing a great job, and I think it's so fantastic. And I'm just going to follow up on what Kara was saying. I'm thinking more globally about these issues. So I'm going to talk about a specific project that I'm working with. It's called Stealing Culture, and it's a collaboration between a law professor and the museum here. You can go ahead and switch to the next slide. Thanks, Alex. On campus here at the University of Wyoming. So on the left is the museum, and on the right is the law school. We're literally across the street. We had never met, and we had both been here almost 10 years. So this just talks to the pillars on campus, which just shows that even museum work, we like to talk to each other, but we're still in our little pillars here. Next slide, please. And so this idea of decolonization is really timely for us to be talking about now because we're seeing it in movies. Everyone should be aware of the Black Panther movie, or the whole scene that talked about giving back objects. But we also like to take it a step further and think about Indiana Jones. That movie came out in the late 80s. Indiana Jones was the hero in that, and he was literally stealing artifacts from Indigenous cultures to put them in a museum at his university. So it's interesting to think about how perceptions have just changed recently in popular media. So it means that people are starting to turn and look at museums, and we need to start figuring out how we can be better stewards of our objects. Next slide, please. So just a few specific projects we've worked on just to start some conversations around this is a question of ownership. Who owns objects? So we've been working with the Tibetan community in exile. They're in northern India. Tibet, the land, is in China, is ruled by China right now. So part of the question is they're starting a museum in northern India. Who owns the objects? Does the Tibetan community in exile, or does China own them? So if they are given an object, can China come and claim ownership over these objects? So it just opens these broader questions that things are not just clear cut when it comes to repatriation. Next slide, please. And then we have to really think creatively to do this work because there's not a lot of money involved, and it's all fantastic for government officials. Thinking of the president of France saying, send all the objects back, send all those African objects back. Well, it's not that easy to send these objects back. There's a whole process that we need to establish first. So one of the projects I worked on was I took students to Cambodia as part of a study abroad project. Previous to leaving, they all learned how to do provenance research, which we can all acknowledge is a pretty specialized way of researching, and it's researching the ownership of an object. So through their project over the summer before we left, they found quite a few objects that they suspected had been looted. There was an object that was in the Denver Art Museum that they decided to return back to Cambodia. So the students got to go see the object in the Denver Art Museum. It was this beautiful sculpture. It was at the center of their Asian art galleries. And then we went to Cambodia and we saw the object after it had been repatriated, and it was sitting in a storage facility, as you see here on the right, open to the elements. It was a bit bug infested when we saw it. So it made the students think, should we just send things back, or do we need to figure out how to send them back and know that they will be cared for, or even if is that should be part of the question or not. So it just opens up more conversations, and thinking creatively is using students to do a bit of the research for us, and they're learning at the same time. Next slide, please. We're also working on digital repatriation project here. We have a large collection of objects from Rapa Nui, which most people know by the colonial name of Easter Island. We have over 200 objects. So what we're doing is we are 3D scanning all of them. So we will have digital files on each of these. Rapa Nui is another one that is a bit complicated when it comes to repatriation, because it is an island that is under the Chilean government. So the question is, if we do send objects back, who do we send them to? Do we send them directly to Rapa Nui? Do we send them to Chile and they send them to Rapa Nui? It becomes this complicated layered system of returning objects. So what we're doing is we're starting with this digital repatriation, which in itself becomes overly complicated because we as a university own the 3D scans of these objects. We can share them with the museum on Rapa Nui, but we still own them because we are a university and we use them for research and things like that. And the question is that appropriate? One of the things we're thinking of doing is a simultaneous exhibition on Rapa Nui and here at the University of Wyoming, where we can 3D print the objects that are on Rapa Nui. I actually have one here. You can see what they look like. We can 3D print them here and they can 3D print our objects there. So we can have this simultaneous exhibition of the same objects thousands of miles apart. And since we print them out white, you can see which ones are missing. So it brings awareness of that objects have moved across continents and oceans. We can do virtual reality, but it's still a question. Digital repatriation is tough because it really becomes a new form of digital colonialism. So next slide, please. We're also working with the University of Lisbon. As you know, Portugal was a big colonial power. And part of the problem that they have is that as a public institution, as we are, their collections are made available to the public and online. They have some very problematic photographs in their collection that were taken by anthropologists way back in the day, which are deemed a little inappropriate and somewhat pornographic now. So the question is, how do they not share these with the public? So that's one of the projects we're working on with them, is to figure out who decides which objects can be available online, which ones, how do you decide what is culturally appropriate? So kind of serving as that intermediary between the museum and the indigenous population to make these decisions or to even start these conversations. Part of the problem is there's no universal guidelines for any of this. We have objects in our collection from Kenya that probably should be returned, but part of it is you just can't call Kenya up on the phone and say, hey, do you want things back? It's not as easy as that. So when the French president says, let's send everything back, that's why the museum community threw up their hands and said, wait a minute, we've got to figure this out. So next slide, please. So that's some of the projects we're working on, and I hope this spurs some questions about what this kind of looks like. This is my research partner there, who is the attorney, and it's our very dramatic picture. But if anybody has any questions too, you can feel free to reach out to me too. So thank you.
Thank you, Kara. Thank you, Nicole. We actually have quite a few questions in the Q&A. So I'm probably going to skip the list of questions that I sent the two of you ahead of time and just jump into the Q&A from the audience. So starting from the top, I have a question. How do you ensure that staff and board representation is genuine and not token? I think this is probably a question for maybe more for Kara, but Nicole, you might have an answer for this too.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question, and is something that you know, we have to grapple with, because this work, it brings up a lot of feelings. It brings up a lot of trauma, especially for people who are part of communities that have experienced heavy loss, heavy trauma. And we're also working, you know, in the midst of a pandemic as well that has been incredibly traumatizing to a lot of folks. And so it's about, you know, making sure in part, and our development folks, our leadership can speak to this far better than I, because I tend to kind of go more into the cultural resources management side of things. But it's about making sure that everyone who is on the board is there to support not only the museum, but to support, you know, the work that we are doing. It's about making sure that we have people in place who want to do the work, and that we're also educating, you know, our team and our board members, so that we're all coming at this work at the same level, because everyone's kind of, you know, at different points within their journey. Like, we have one board member who was definitely an old school archaeologist, but watching this person grow and change and recognize the ways in which colonialism has been centered within them, watching them change and become, you know, this fantastic leader and really a giant advocate for the work that we do has been amazing. But then also we have to recognize that we have Indigenous community members that are sitting on the board who may not feel the same way about, you know, what we're doing. So it's about having these hard conversations and about treating each other with respect, and recognizing that, you know, we may not always agree, but that we have to start somewhere. But I want to, you know, let Nicole jump in as well.
So my perspective is a little different, because the work that we're doing here with the Steel and Culture Project is in addition to everything else we're doing. So it's just the two of us right now, and, you know, student employees and student interns and things like that. So our biggest challenge really is getting administration and other people to recognize the importance of this project. So it just becomes an extracurricular activity. And I think that might be one of the largest challenges with decolonization of museum collections, and just the work in general, is the support. And you're so lucky you have so much support at the Museum of Us for this initiatives. But I think there's so many other museums out there that aren't supported in this way. And, you know, I'm always out screaming from the tops of the buildings out here, you know, this is important work we're doing. And a lot of it is that people just don't understand museums and what we do either. So it's so much education just to get people on board to realize how important all this is. So like I said, we have to think creatively here too. So using a lot of students and lots of partnerships on campus, like the partnership we have with the 3D modeling and digital libraries on campus, just to get the digital stuff done. So we just can't do it alone.
There's a related question similar to this is, how have you been approaching the shift in board structure / representation of community?
Carefully, very carefully, because because to kind of echo back to that first question of tokenization, this is not about checking a box. We have, you know, one Kumeyaay person, one Paim Kuichum, you know, it's not about that. It's about figuring out, is the board in a place where it is open and welcoming and a safe space for community members to step in and take up this role of leadership within the museum and within the institution. I wish it's not really my huge area of influence and scope, but yeah, it's about making sure that also we're not just picking and choosing, allies in the work. We do want allies to work with us as well around, supporting the museum. But, it's about having a conversation with the leadership of the various communities that we're working with. And we've made blunders in the past. It's not always worked out, but it's about recognizing that when it didn't work out, where did it not work out, and how do we do better? And so, talking with the leadership of the communities and figuring out, do they have a person or people that that have the capacity, A1, to sit on a board for an institution, what are the community's directives and responsibilities that they feel that we need to undertake as a board. So we're in a space where we are actively working to increase our scope and to see how we can build more Indigenous representation into the board structure. It's a place where we are not quite there yet, but it's something that we're actively working towards. And as we get better at it, we'll start having more conversations about how we're doing that process.
So this one's directed to you, Kara, but I think Nicole, you could also answer this too. Do you recall any situation where the Indigenous community and museums workers disagreed about some topic? What was this, and how did you solve it if you were able to?
Might need to think on that for a minute. Nicole, did you have an example that you might be willing to share at this moment?
Yeah, while you're thinking about it, it actually deals with human remains in a European museum. Just the colonial perspective is very different in the US and in Europe. And the question was that, or the issue was that some human remains from one museum had gone to another in Europe, and the museum wanted them back for research. And what we were kind of suggesting was maybe we don't bring them back and we repatriate them instead of using them for research. But the argument on behalf of the museum was they just wanted these remains back for research. They couldn't get past that. They are something to be used for scientific research, rather than acknowledging that this was a human being at one point in time. So I think it's just more of this educating. And Kara, your museum is so much further along than so many other museums. I mean, this seems obvious to all of us, but it was a really difficult conversation to have.
Yeah, and I think it's one that we've had as well. And I think, I don't know if it's so much different in opinions, but more about the expression of fear around what happens when you repatriate everything. Does that mean you're a museum anymore? And while I wasn't part of these larger board discussions, or especially around the policy or curation, our colonial pathways policy, there was long discussions around what does it mean if we repatriate, some or all of what we hold, which that's never going to happen. We have so many cultural resources within our holdings that it's going to take us decades to kind of work through this process. But really, it's been about shifting that fear into an opportunity, about seeing it as a way to build relationships, to build trust with the communities that we have harmed. And once you start to kind of flip that script and have that conversation, you start to see people's minds and hearts open and realize, oh, we can do this. It is the right thing to do. So really, at least early on, it was that kind of fear of change. And are we a museum any longer if we are doing this work? And we absolutely 100% are. And it's about changing what a museum is, potentially changing the definition from that, 17th, 18th, 19th century idea of what a museum is, a repository of the world's treasures, into spaces that should be about and for the communities that museums are supposed to serve. We say it, but we actually need to really do it. And that's how this work manifests itself in making us do that and become those spaces that we really should be.
This next question is really interesting. Often these talks focus on larger museums or ones who have Indigenous material already. What are some ways to decolonize when your museum does not have any Indigenous materials, but wants to do better in practice and policy?
I can start this one. We actually do a lot of that here because in Wyoming, we don't have a lot of diversity here. So part of our mission is to bring more diversity to the state. We're the only academic art museum in the entire state, and our state is huge. You can fit the entire UK into the state of Wyoming. We only have 500,000 people in our whole state. So we always say that we are a big small town with long driveways, or a small town with long driveways. And so part of what we do is when we bring in an exhibition, we invite community members, especially if it's an Indigenous type exhibition that has Indigenous materials in it. We invite them to share their voice. We just did an exhibition on identity, and part of it was inviting the artists to come in and speak about their work and how they think of identity through their work. Some of it was the curators writing some of the text for the pieces. Some of it was other people, community members writing the text. So when you walk through the exhibition and you read each of the object labels, it started to be this conversation and you could hear the different voices come out. And I think that's it through exhibition practices doing that way. It's acknowledging that the curator is not the end all be all with information and knowledge. It's everybody has some sort of knowledge to be shared, and it's opening yourself up to acknowledge that and then share that. And it takes a lot of work to do it. It's not easy.
No, definitely, and it does take a lot of work. And so kudos to you all for finding ways to make culture happen. Also, it's not decolonizing isn't just about, the cultural resources that you steward. Our institution, our history, one of my colleagues says, our colonial rot started with our cultural resources and the way in which we acquired. But there are many museums, institutions that don't have collections, but they can still be colonial as all get out. It's about how the history of that institution has been impacted by colonialism, imperialism, other isms. So it's about looking at your human resources policies and seeing what ways might these cause inequities, might be harmful or racist or whatever. It's about taking a look at your membership models and seeing, are these exclusionary? Is there a way in which we can not only bring more people in, but can we go out to the communities? It's about having these conversations at different touching points within the various departments and subsets of your institution to see how can we become more decolonial in practice as a whole, not just necessarily with the folks who are working down in the basement with the cultural resources. It's kind of woven into everything, especially with us, of everything that we do, or at least we're trying.
This next question, I think, is a great opportunity for you to talk about cheap fat, Kara. So here in Jamaica, as a former British colony, we would like our artifacts returned from the British Museum that were taken out of the country before independence. And they are using the excuse that we cannot take care of them, even though we have a national museum with trained staff. There's been a few questions regarding conservation, so I think this would be a great topic to talk about.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I say malarkey, malarkey to that. But really, that is colonialism right there. It is stating that, no, we know better than you how to take care of these items, when in fact that is just factually inaccurate and untrue. And when you actually recognize not only contemporary ways of conservation management, but also traditional ways of conservation management, and Alex mentioned sheep fat, and it has a reason why she said it, and that's because we had the opportunity to consult and have conversations and continue a relationship with the Maasai people who reside in Kenya and Tanzania, the border crossed their traditional territories as well. And so when we were consulting with them over a variety of different cultural resources, we were kind of taken to task by the cultural ambassador for not taking proper care of these ongarempe. They are lion spears, these big long lion spears. They're kind of what you visualize whenever you think of the Maasai people. And he was like, "What are you doing? You are not taking care of these belongings correctly." And we're like, well, how do we do do that? What should we do? This typical conservation methods require special chemicals, special cleaners and solvents and things of that nature. And he told us plain and simply, you just need to use sheep fat. You just need to use sheep fat, fresh sheep fat, you know, rub it on the metal, shine it up, and it will be perfect. And you just do it once a year. And, you know, I know back then, my little bit of conservation heart was like, what? But you set that aside and you're like, okay. And so I procured sheep fat from our local butcher, and that was a fun conversation. And then I proceeded to perform the appropriate cultural care. And for me, it was one of the most transformational experiences I've ever had in working with a cultural resource. As soon as I started to use the appropriate materials, the appropriate methods, this beautiful Orngarempe just shone and came back to life. And so really, when you use the traditional practice, when you do what the community says, it is incredibly liberating, because there is no reason why you shouldn't be able to do these things. And so that's really just colonialism coming back around, saying you aren't the authority of your own cultural heritage. And that's just simply not right. So I'm happy to have a conversation with whomever asked the question. Feel free to email me afterwards and I can have a conversation with you guys.
No,
The
and
same person. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Nicole.
I was just going to quickly say too, you know, I'm on the same boat too. Is these are conversations that need to be had. I mean, the Benin bronzes are the biggest example that's being talked about right now. You know, the British Museum say, no, you can't have them back because you can't care for them. You don't have a museum. So they build a museum and then say, no, you can't have them back because it's a change of parliament and law. And then Parliament saying, no, it's not part of our law. The British Museum is their own thing. They can do what they want to do. And, you know, they're still not back where they should be. So it's an interesting, it's a lot of finger pointing, I think, goes on when it should be a lot of conversations that need to happen instead.
Yeah, it's that intentional road blocking to keep when it doesn't make sense to keep. The amount of energy that is spent putting up these roadblocks could be spent elsewhere, making sure they get home. And that's why it's so frustrating, but that's why we fight and we have these conversations and we keep pushing forward.
And in our head too, we think colonialism is dead, but it really isn't, because that's exactly what that is. It's putting up those roadblocks. It's just continuing this idea of colonialism.
We have so many great questions, but we only have a few minutes left. So I want to have opportunity for one last question before we're done with today's session. So you guys have talked a lot about your processes with all of your work. Do you have resources that you'd like to share that have helped your work be successful, or just, you know, verbally share some of those resources, or I'm happy to add them into the chat too if you have them accessible.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Oh, there we go. Our resources are really about, in part, working with our colleagues, making those connections. So I'm part of the Enrich Cultural Network that is full of really fantastic individuals who are doing work in their own ways. There's also some wonderful resources around digital asset management, around stewardship. I know we're not supposed to like say the names specifically, but I'm thinking of the Mukutu specifically, if you know what I'm talking about, Alex. That is a fantastic space that allows, that sets a space for Indigenous communities to work with institutions around how to change information within their databases in order to be more reflective of the traditional knowledge and information that's available. It's also about open to collaborate and all of that. And then also just, not last but not least, but the community members that are within our, within our community that we need to be talking to. So valuing them as a resource, whatever that means, if they are willing and interested, of course. We never want to push our way into a community if they are not in a space to be working with us. But those are some of the areas that we have, but this really relying on our community of not only museum professionals, but Indigenous community members, people of color, other communities of color, and what they have to say and the resources they are willing to share.
And I would add too, partnerships. So like universities are a big resource. You know, this is what these people have studied their entire life. So like we rely heavily on our anthropology department, our Native American Studies program. Obviously, I'm working a lot with the law program. And so in that has taken me to law conferences where I get to speak to lawyers about these issues. And you can just see their brains turn on when they hear this because they can give us a different perspective on these things. And it's things that we think are normal and we talk about every day, but when you take it to a different group and they're just like, well, we had no idea that this was an issue. And then they have these new ideas. So I think really making these partnerships like we have with the digital libraries and all the technologies on campus that we have. And I would say, you know, think about students too, because like I said, they can do some of the work for you and they can get credit and they get to learn. And so it's thinking creatively and how we can work with other people. Museum institutions. So I'm a board member of UMAC, which is part of ICOM, which is University Museums and Collections. And I have a question and I rely heavily on them when it comes to getting answers about anything. So I would say those are great resources for us too. And just talking to Kara too.
Same here.
Thank you, Nicole and Kara, for sharing your work with us today. This is such a fantastic conversation and so grateful to have you here. Unfortunately, we are at time. I do know you can reach Kara and Nicole through the Hublot platform. So I know we unfortunately didn't get to all of the questions today, but you should be able to reach out to them directly if you want to talk to them more after this session. Head over to track 1 for our final presentation, Managing Assets at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. Thank you again, everyone, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.